Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 1. American History, the Colonial Period, and Independence. Part 1. The Colonial Period. This lesson discusses the colonial period of American history. It describes how the 13 original colonies came to exist and how those 13 colonies gained their independence from Great Britain, becoming the United States. The colonial period of American history is the time from the early 1600s, when the first permanent European settlements were created in North America, until shortly after 1776, when the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain. Many centuries ago, people in Europe called what we now know as Southeast Asia the Indies. Traders in Europe dedicated months or even years of their lives to acquiring seasonings and fabrics from India, China, and the so-called Spice Islands of the Indies to sell back in their home countries. European businessmen who traveled to Asia could make lots of money by bringing back cinnamon, silk, and other spices and fabrics considered luxuries in Europe. Whether traveling by land or by sea, however, the trade routes used to get from Europe to the Indies were very long, difficult, and dangerous. Starting in the 1400s, the route many traders used to travel by sea took them all the way around the continent of Africa. Christopher Columbus was a European navigator and explorer who wanted to find a shorter way to the Indies. Columbus believed that if he sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean, he would reach the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia more quickly. Most geographers in Europe believed Columbus was wrong. They predicted his plan would lead him to die in the middle of the ocean without anywhere to stop for food or fresh water. Columbus was confident that the distance between Europe and the Indies was not as great as most Europeans thought, however. Eventually, he convinced the King and Queen of Spain to give him the money and resources to test his hypothesis. With 3 ships financed by the Spanish monarchs, Columbus sailed out west, across the Atlantic Ocean. After about 2 months of sailing, Columbus landed on a tropical island. He assumed this was proof his estimation of the distance between Europe and East Asia was correct. As far as Columbus and his crew knew, they had reached the Indies as planned. It seemed like they had found a new route that could be used by European businessmen trading in spices and fabrics. In fact, however, Columbus had not reached Southeast Asia. He had landed on an island in a completely different part of the world. He was in an area we now call the Caribbean. Columbus first landed on an island in what we know today as the Bahamas. He went on to explore parts of the islands now called Cuba, Jamaica, and Hispaniola, or Santo Domingo. Today, the Caribbean islands Columbus visited are still often called the West Indies, because Columbus believed he had reached the Indies by sailing west. People had already been living in the Americas for thousands of years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. Columbus encountered some of those people. Because he thought he was in the Indies, he referred to them as Indians. Even later, when it became clear that Columbus had made a mistake, the name stuck. People who lived in the Americas before Columbus's voyage are still often called American Indians. American Indians and their descendants are also now known as Native Americans. Although there were already millions of Native Americans living in the Caribbean, South America, and North America long before the Europeans arrived, People in England, France, Italy, and other parts of Europe called the Americas the New World. As word spread in Europe of the lands Columbus had accidentally visited on the other side of the ocean, more and more Europeans began crossing the Atlantic to settle in the Americas. There's a national U.S. holiday in October that recognizes this pivotal moment in history, Columbus Day. Civics test question. Who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? Who lived in America before the Europeans arrived? American Indians. Before Columbus and other Europeans arrived, American Indians, or Native Americans, lived in America. In the early 1600s, people from several European countries began founding colonies in America. Many colonies in America were created by British people who wanted a different life for themselves and for their children than what they had in Europe. These colonists came to America for freedom. Many Europeans who crossed the Atlantic were looking for specific kinds of freedom: political liberty, religious freedom, which included the freedom to practice their religion, or economic opportunity. Colonists also came to escape persecution. Plymouth, Massachusetts, is a famous example of a colony created by people who came to America looking for religious freedom. Plymouth was founded by pilgrims who disagreed with some of the teachings of the Church of England. They left Britain to escape religious persecution. The pilgrims sailed to Plymouth on a ship called the Mayflower in 1620. Traveling from Europe to the Americas was long and difficult. The Atlantic Ocean is huge, and anyone trying to cross it by ship in the 1600s faced many dangers and hardships. However, many Europeans, like the Pilgrims, felt that the potential rewards of the journey were worth the risks. As time went on, more and more people from Europe sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to North America, the Caribbean, and South America to make new lives for themselves, where they could have more freedom. North America was an especially popular destination for British colonists. In 1607, the first permanent British colony in North America was created in Virginia. Most colonists in the settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, came looking for economic opportunity. They raised crops that could be sold for lots of money in Europe. For example, the English colonist John Rolfe, who married Pocahontas, the famous daughter of a Native American leader, made a fortune selling tobacco grown in Virginia. Although many Europeans came to North America in search of freedom and economic opportunity in the 1600s and 1700s, at the same time, tens of thousands of people from Africa were brought here and forced to work without pay or rights of any kind. Instead of gaining freedom, their freedom was taken away. People who were forced into this kind of involuntary labor were called slaves. During the colonial period, there were people from Africa working as slaves on tobacco plantations, like John Rolfe's in Virginia, and on farms and in wealthy households in all 13 colonies, including Connecticut. This advertisement for a slave auction was placed in a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper in 1760. By the end of the colonial period, over 300,000 Africans had been brought to America as slaves. Civics test question. What is one reason colonists came to America? What is one reason colonists came to America? Freedom. Colonists came to America for freedom. Some kinds of freedom colonists wanted included political liberty, religious freedom, and economic opportunity. Colonists also came to America to practice their religion and to escape persecution. Civics test question. What group of people was taken and sold as slaves? What group of people was taken and sold as slaves? Africans. Africans were taken to America and sold as slaves. For more than 2 centuries, people from Africa were sold into slavery in America. During the time European colonists were traveling to North America in search of freedom, and people from Africa were being brought across the Atlantic Ocean to work as slaves, Native American people lived all throughout the continent. They didn't all belong to one uniform nation. Instead, they belonged to many different nations or tribes, each with its own distinct culture and history. Native Americans across the continent spoke many different languages, held many different sets of beliefs, and had many different ways of living. There are still millions of Native Americans living in the United States. Currently, the U.S. federal government officially recognizes more than 500 Native American tribes or nations in the 48 contiguous states and Alaska. Here are just some well-known Native American people of the past and present. Manawa and Manuelito were resistance fighters who led battles against the U.S. and Mexican militaries. Manawa was a leader of the Muskogee Creek Nation and lived in what's now the state of Alabama. Manuelito was a leader of the Navajo Nation and lived in what's now Utah. W. Richard West, Jr. is a citizen of the combined Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. He's a historian and the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Susan LaFlèche Picot of the Omaha tribe was the first Native American woman to obtain a medical degree from a university. Len Malerba, also known by the name of Many Hearts, is from Connecticut and is a chief of the Mohegan tribe. In Connecticut, two of the largest Native American people groups are the Mohegan tribe and the Pequot tribe. Mohegan and Pequot people have lived in the Connecticut area for many hundreds of years and have played a large part in the history of the region. In fact, the name Connecticut comes from a word in the Mohegan Pequot language that means beside the long river. In addition to her duties as chief of the Mohegan tribe, Lynn Malerba has worked for the federal government as Treasurer of the United States. Charles Laloma was a Hopi artist who had a large influence on other artists in the southwestern United States. Sequoyah was a member of the Cherokee Nation who created a writing system for the Cherokee language that is still used today. Geronimo was an Apache healer and war leader. John Harrington is a NASA astronaut and a member of the Chickasaw Nation. Civics test question. Name one American Indian tribe in the United States. Name one American Indian tribe in the United States. Mohegan. The Mohegan tribe. There are many Mohegan people in Connecticut. Another tribe that has lived in the Connecticut area since long before the Europeans arrived is the Pequot. There are more than 500 Native American tribes recognized by the U.S. government today, including the Mohegan, the Pequot, the Cherokee, and the Navajo. During the colonial period, relations between colonists and American Indians were sometimes hostile, sometimes friendly, and sometimes somewhere in between. From the time of the first encounters, colonists and Native Americans attacked one another. As more colonists came to America, such violent clashes grew more common. In colonial Connecticut, Some Dutch and English colonists came into conflict with factions of the Pequot tribe, among other Native American groups. They fought a series of battles throughout New England in what was called the Pequot War. European colonists killed hundreds of Pequot people during this so called war, including murdering many unarmed children, elders, and women during a particularly bloody attack, now known as the Pequot Massacre. Colonial governments often pushed Native Americans off land they wanted to use, and after the U.S. became a country, the U.S. government continued the pattern by forcefully displacing many more Native Americans. The government required the people of several Native American nations to leave their original homelands and move to restricted areas called reservations. This led directly to the deaths of thousands of Native Americans and has caused huge ongoing problems for the surviving members of the displaced nations. Their descendants continue to work to address these issues in the present day. Despite the many conflicts and government abuses that took place throughout the colonial period and early U.S. history, however, there were also instances in which Native American tribes or nations made alliances with colonists. There are many historical examples of colonists and Native Americans living alongside one another in peace. The most famous example of peaceful relations between colonists and Native Americans is the story of an event popularly known as the First Thanksgiving. In 1620, about 100 English pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean on the Mayflower. They landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts, in late fall and had very little food. That winter, half the pilgrims died. However, in the spring, Native Americans of the Wampanoag tribe taught the pilgrims how to raise local crops, catch fish, and hunt local animals. As a result, the colonists were much better prepared for the next winter. To give thanks, the pilgrims invited the Native Americans to a feast. Much later, in the 1800s, President Abraham Lincoln declared Thanksgiving Day a national U.S. holiday. Like the English colonists and their Wampanoag neighbors in the 1600s, many people celebrate Thanksgiving now by gathering with family and friends in November and holding a harvest feast. Together, they eat foods like turkey, corn, potatoes, and pumpkin pie and express their gratitude for making it through another year. Often, Americans celebrating Thanksgiving will take turns talking about specific things they are thankful for. Civics test question. Name 2 national U.S. holidays. Name 2 national U.S. holidays. Thanksgiving and Columbus Day. 2 national U.S. holidays are Thanksgiving and Columbus Day. Thanksgiving is celebrated in November, and Columbus Day is celebrated in October. Another national U.S. holiday that will be discussed in the next video is Independence Day. Independence Day is celebrated in July.